Welcome, everyone, to Dittofi No Code Nights with the co-founders of Dittofi, Samuel and James Virgo, and sponsored by Prono Coders, or hosted by Prono Coders. We're excited to have you here. Last week, we started building an Airbnb clone, otherwise known as a two-sided marketplace. And this week, we're going to go over specifically building the backend for a two-sided marketplace. But just as a reminder, if you are looking for help learning how to use Dittofi as your platform, please go check out pronocoders.com. We have a bootcamp ready to go to help teach you. And you get access to us in Slack to ask all of your questions. And we'd be also happy to have you as office hours members. Please go check us out. Thank you so much for being here, Samuel. We're ready to learn.
Awesome. Last week we went over high level, the kind of data structure for building up a two-sided marketplace. And I explained a bit how the data structure related to the whole workflow of managing these marketplaces. And today I'm going to go into more detail in that by actually starting to build out some of the back-end functionality. Specifically going to look at the whole transaction flow, what happens when someone comes onto the platform, signs up, and tries to make a booking. So if I just close this down a second, I'm just going to bring up this screenshot, which is similar to what we looked at last week. This looks a little bit complicated, but we're basically going to break down these different components here in order to explain and build up a whole transaction flow. So a whole process of someone signing into a platform like Airbnb, for example, making a booking, having their booking accepted, the money taken, right the way through to the point where you leave a review of your whole experience. So as a very quick recap, this entire process that we see here, we're going to be calling a transaction. And each of these little blue or purple, I should say, boxes are the different states that this transaction is going to go through. So at the beginning, someone's going to come to the platform and try and make a booking. That'll be the initial state of the transaction. They're going to have to make a payment, at which point the state's going to go to payment required, right the way through to the host accepting the booking, through to getting delivered, and then actually someone reviewing it. So each of these different purple boxes here are the different states of the transaction. And the way we're going to move between these different states is by creating, back-end actions on the Dittofi platform. So I have a back-end action that takes someone from this initial state of coming to the platform through to this state of actually reviewing their whole booking experience. So jumping across into the builder here, I'm in the marketplace app that we made last time, all the same tables. Just before this, very quickly added a sign up endpoint just so we could create new users for our app, and a action here to get the user that's currently logged into the system. So right now, the user that's currently logged in, I need to build this to show it, but the actual user that's currently logged in is going to be me. So let's say now that I've signed up, logged into the platform, what I want to do to begin with is to kick off this entire transaction flow. I want to start off by creating some transactions. So if you're thinking of Airbnb, this could be at the point where someone goes to the booking page on Airbnb and goes to make a booking. What I've done to make this a bit more clear is I've broken down the different steps as well into this document that I showed you last week as well, where each of the different backend actions in Dittofi are going to be listed out here. I'm going to say kind of what parameters we need and what these things are going to be doing. So to begin with, the first thing we want to do is create a new transaction. So as I said, go to the platform, click a button to make a booking. This is going to create a new transaction. So I'm going to create a new action here that I'm going to call initialize transaction. If I look at the document I've written up, I've got one here called initialize transaction. That's my first backend action. And the parameters I'm going to be passing this are going to be the listing that I want to actually make my booking for. So as a reminder, we had a listings table in here, which is going to store a list of all the different properties. If we're doing Airbnb, different properties that we can actually book. So this could be like, call this test listing, but this could be, I don't know, like Airbnb property or something like this. This is one of the actual properties that you're going to come and book. So when I start my transaction off, I want to give it the ID of the listing that I'm actually going to be making a booking of. So that's going to be my parameter that I'm passing into this action. Then what I want to do essentially is create a record in the transactions table. And we'll talk through these different, what's going to go into what column in a second. And then under here, I've got a condition which has to pass in order for my action to work. And that condition is that I want to make sure this listing actually exists. You can't book you can't start a transaction for a listing that doesn't exist. This is an example of how you might break down your way of thinking about building any kind of action on Dittofi or any platform or in code. You can think about the parameters that's action is going to be taking. You can think about what that's supposed to be doing. And then you can also think about any conditions that have to be met for this given action to work. So if we want to translate this into the platform, I've already created the action called initialize transaction. So I'm going to do add trigger. Today, I'm going to use the action trigger type rather than the endpoint one. What the action trigger type does is it allows you to call this action from inside another action. So I'm going to build my actions out like this, and then I'm going to reference them in other actions, which I'll show you in a moment. So in terms of the inputs for this, I said I want to give the listing ID that I'm going to be booking. So I'll add a variable here, which is going to be a number. I'll call this listing ID and save. Then I'm also going to actually pass in the, if we have a look at our transactions table, let's go back here, transactions. We need to give it a listing ID, which I'm passing in. And then I also want to know who's actually making the transaction. So I'm going to pass in a user ID as well, which we might call, let's see, we could call that the customer ID. So this is going to be the person that's actually making the booking. It's going to be the ID of a given user that's actually making the booking. Then inside here, I've said I want to create a record in my transactions table. So I'm just going to add an event, and that event is going to be the create event. And I'm going to go to the transactions table, and I'm going to say I want to create a new transaction with the customer ID set to the customer ID that I'm passing in here. The listing ID set to the listing ID that I'm passing in here. Then I've got a few other parameters here. So the booking ID, I'm going to leave empty for now. The provider ID is supposed to be the ID of the user that's actually selling or providing this given listing. So in the two-sided marketplace, we're going to have one person buying or one person selling. So the customer is the person who's buying, and the provider is going to be the person that's selling. If I look at my document, I said the listing ID, the provider ID is going to be the ID of the user who actually created or provided the listing. So if I look in my listings table, you can see I have a creator ID field here. So this is the ID of the user that created this listing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a variable down here, which can be a model variable. And this model is going to represent the individual listing that I'm actually making my transaction for. So I can look at my listings table and I can say where ID equals the ID that I'm passing into this action. So that's going to look up my listing. And now that I've got that listing, I can take the creator ID and use that as the provider ID there. Then we've got the transaction state ID. So in here, I said I want to set my state as well. So as I explained in this diagram here, this transaction is going to go through different states. And I want to record what state the transaction is in. And I'm going to do that by updating the value in this transaction state ID column here. So as a reminder, I've got a separate table here called transaction states, which has got a list of all the different possible transaction states. If you were building this, you might want to have different states. So you might want to have different names depending on the actual workflow that your whole transaction is going through. For me, I want to use these states here. So I want to start off with an initial state, which means the transaction has just begun. So to do that, I'm just going to, let's say, create a new variable here. Or in fact, I'm going to create a global variable here, which I'm going to use as a text variable. And I'm going to call this transaction state initial. Or in fact, we could do this as a number variable. We could just do number 1. So this will be the initial transaction state is going to be number 1. And that's going to reference the number 1 here. So that's the ID of the initial transaction state. And I can just use that here. This is going to run. It's going to create a new transaction. So I'm just going to give that the name of new transaction. So this as option here is going to store the whole record that we just created with all of the columns populated. The other fields that I've got here were booking ID. We're going to ignore that for now. The booking is going to come slightly later, you'll see. And we'll ignore this. We'll discuss this transition ID later on. As a comment here, I could just add in something like create transaction. So this given action can run from inside other actions. It can take inputs that I've shown you here, and it can also return stuff out of it. So I'm going to create a return variable here, which is going to get return out of this action. And I'm just going to call this transaction ID. And this is going to be the ID of the new transaction that I've just made. So I've created this new transaction here. So what I need to do is add one last event here. And in this last event, I can use the assign event, and I can say I'm going to assign the transaction ID, so this return variable, equal to the ID of the new transaction. So I could say assign return variable, for example. So now this is a kind of action that I can use anywhere within my app. So in reality, someone's going to come to my app and click a button to make a booking. So I might create a new action here, which I might call, let's say, I look back at my screenshot, we could call this one request booking, let's say. This is going to be, or actually I could call this, let's say, initiate transaction, maybe a better name. This one here, then I can run from an endpoint. This is going to be the run from the front end of my app. And this is going to take, and what I'm going to do in this initiate transaction is I'm just going to call the other action that we just made. So I can do run action, and I can pick the initialize transaction action that I've made. So you see when I pick that, it's going to ask me for a listing ID, customer ID, because we specified those for the input variables, this other action. And then it's also going to return me a transaction ID. What I want to do is on my endpoint trigger, I want to set the authentication profile to say you have to be logged in order to run this. And then I also want to pass this the listing ID that I'm actually purchasing. So for now, I'm just going to create a query variable here, which could be listing ID, save. And then if I come back to my first events, do run action, run initialize transaction, I'm going to pass it the listing ID, and I'm going to pass it the current user ID as the customer ID. And that's going to now run that initialized transaction every time we run this one here. So that's going to actually kick my transaction off, as well as if I take a look at this diagram here, as well as initializing the transaction, the other things I want to do is I want to actually create a booking at the same time. So if you take a look in my bookings table here, this is where I can come to actually specify that I'm going to be making a given booking. So each booking is going to have a start time and an end time. So those are the dates between which the booking is taking place. And then they're also going to have a state. So as a reminder, we've got this booking states table, which has the different states that a booking can be in. So what I want to do when the person initializes their transaction is I want to create a booking, and I want to actually set the state of that booking just equal to pending. So the booking is different from the whole transaction. So it will go through different states. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another action here, which I can just call, if I come back to my document, actually, we have another one here called create pending booking. So I'll do one here called create pending booking. So this is going to be another one that I run as a action. I need to give it the start date and the end date of the booking. I need to give the number of seats or the number of people that are actually going to be making the booking. So as input parameters for this, we're going to do start date, and then end date. And then we're going to do seats, which will be a number. And then I also want to, if I take a look in my bookings table, you'll see there's a transaction ID column here. So as I said a few times, everything in here is going to be part of the same transaction. So this concept of a transaction encapsulates everything in this diagram. And the way we're going to link everything together is by using this transaction ID column here. So I'm also going to give this the transaction ID. Should be a number. So those are going to be the inputs. When this actually runs, then what do I want to do? I want to create a record in my bookings table with the state set to pending payment. And then all the other columns are going to be set by the parameters that I've passed in. So if I come here, I can just do add event. I can do create to create a new event, create a new record. Go to my bookings table, and I can say end time, start time, seats, and transaction ID and state ID. Actually, I want to set all of these columns. So the end time is going to be equal to the end date that I've passed in here, and start time equal to the start date. Might rename these to, let's say, start time and end time, just to match what I've got in the other table. And then the seats is going to be equal to the seats that I'm passing in. So that's the number of places you're reserving. And the transaction ID will be equal to the transaction ID that I'm passing in. And then the state ID that I've got here, I want to create my booking in a pending state. So I'm going to come down here again and add a global variable, same as I did before. And I'm going to call this one booking state pending. And this can be number 1, because if we look in our booking states table, pending is number 1. And then I can just set that like so. Then this is going to be the new booking. Call this new booking. This is going to store all the data for the new booking that I just created. And as a description, I might just do create booking. When this runs, we're going to create that new booking, which is going to have the same transaction ID as the one that I created in my I created in the initialized transaction. And I'm going to return a variable out of this as well. The variable I'm going to return is just the booking ID. So this will be the ID of the new booking that I just made. So again, I can add an event here. And this event, I can use the assign event, and I can say I'm going to set my return variable booking ID equal to the ID of that new booking that I just made. So now I've got a second action that I've made here. So what I could do now is I could go into this initiate transaction one that I made, and I could add another event. And in the second event, I could do run action again. And I could pick that create pending booking action, and I can just pass in the transaction ID that I got from the previous action. And then start time, end time, and seats. These are all going to be taken from the front end of my app. So these, again, can be inputs to the endpoint. So I could add in here, let's say, start time, end time, and seats at the end. And save. So now I can do another run action here. And in this one here, I could say, create pending booking. We're going to have transaction ID, start time, end time, and seats. So now this initial action that I'm running is going to run these two kind of sub actions. The first off, initialize transaction. And then secondly, let's see, to create the pending booking. The other thing, let's see, that I want to do in here is I'm going to want to actually integrate this with some given payment provider. So this could be Stripe, or it could be like PayPal or one of these other payment providers that's out there. So to do that, you might want to create another action now, which you could call something like we're doing Stripe, like create Stripe checkout, for example. This could be run from another action, which means, again, we can kick this off from the original initiate transaction action that we're making. So for the Stripe checkout one, the implementation of this will vary depending on what payment provider you're going to be using. So for now, I'll skip this one and just come back to it. And I can give some more examples of using Stripe or a different payment provider after that. But for now, let's just embed this in here as well. So I'm going to add a new event here, which I'm going to call the create Stripe checkout. And I can skip the description up here. So at this point here, you would have created a new transaction, you would have created a pending booking, and you would have created some payment session for a user to actually go and make a payment. So if we take a look at this diagram here, this kind of encapsulates these first few things here. Create booking. We're going to get our transaction price and create some kind of payment link, either with Stripe or some other payment provider. And we're going to create a booking and link that all together as a transaction. After that, again, depending on what payment provider you use, you're going to get some notification that the payment has gone through successfully. And when that has happened, you can kind of move the user on to this next pre-authorized state here. So what we could do is we could create another action here, which we could call something like, let me see what I put in here. In my case, I could call this like complete checkout session, because I'm going to be using Stripe for this. But again, depending on what particular payment provider we're using, this could be slightly different. And what this one is going to do is essentially, this is going to be a notification from your payment provider to tell you that the payment has gone through successfully. So what this is going to need to take is going to be the transaction ID that we're dealing with. So as the input parameter for this, we'll do the transaction ID. And let me just actually come back here and take a quick look. So I've also created this Stripe checkout session table here. So for now, let's just do this. If we go back to our create Stripe checkout, I'm going to add transaction ID as a input to that. Let's see. And if I come back to my initiate transaction, I can pass in the transaction ID that we're dealing with here. And what I'm going to do for now in my create Stripe checkout is write a record into that Stripe checkout table. So let's do database requests, create Stripe checkout sessions, and then do transaction ID, and pass in the transaction ID, the input variable. This will be my new checkout session here. So actually, yeah, let's fill this in a little bit. We'll need this for the rest of the example. Then when we go to, let's say, complete Stripe checkout session, this is going to take a transaction ID here. And it's also going to take a checkout session ID as well. This will be the ID of the checkout session that was created. And what I want to do in here is I want to essentially update I want to check that this transaction exists, and then I want to update my booking to move it from the pending to proposed state here to kind of signify that the payment's actually being made. And then after that, I'm going to give the other user the option to actually accept the booking here. So let's say add a new event here. I'm going to go and let's say look up my whole checkout session for this one. So let's go checkout session. Look at my checkout sessions table. Oh, sorry, that should be under this variable section here. So look in my checkout sessions table here and say where transaction ID is equal to the transaction ID that I'm passing in here. And actually, in that case, I don't need this checkout session ID. I'm going to link everything just based on this transaction ID here. And then let's also look in my bookings table. So I'll look up the associated booking, which again is going to be where the transaction ID is equal to the transaction ID that I'm setting here. And then I can update my booking. So I can come database requests, update, select my booking, and I could say update the state ID. And again, I'll come and create a global variable for this, which I could call, let's say, booking state proposed. Okay, number 2. We'll update my booking state to tell me that the initial booking's gone through. So at this point, we know that the users initialized their transaction, they've created a booking, gone through some payment provider, and then after that, we've received some notification from the payment provider, at which point we can update the booking state of our transaction. We might also at this point want to update the transaction state as well. So if I add another event above here, I can do a model. I could say this will be the actual transaction I'm going to be updating. Let's see, transactions. We can say where ID is equal to the transaction ID. So what I could do now is just update my transaction. And I can set the transaction state ID equal to the next state. So if I look in my transaction states table, this will now move to this pre-authorized state here. So at this point, the booking's been confirmed. So we're going to move this to the pre-authorized state. So again, I create a global variable here. This one could be called transaction state pre-authorized. Should be state free. So then I can just update my transaction to transaction state pre-authorized. So now when we go to update my booking, we're also going to update the transaction state so we can see that we've moved through to this next stage here. This complete checkout session here will be called from the payment provider when they kind of confirm the payment's gone through. So we're going to have some endpoint for that as well. Which if we look in here, we could call something like confirm payment, let's say. And this is going to be triggered by an endpoint, and this is just going to run the confirm, or in fact, this is going to run the complete checkout session one that we made here. So now I'm going to add a transaction ID as a query variable. This might change slightly later on, depending on the payment provider implementation. So come here, do run action. We'll do complete checkout session, transaction ID. That's going to be getting run here. So now we've got the initial endpoint here that's going to run when the user clicks to actually make their booking. In this initial endpoint, we're going to initialize our transaction, create our pending booking, and create our payment link. Once that's done, we're then going to have another endpoint here called confirm payment that our payment provider is going to run. And in here, all we're going to do is run this complete checkout session action, which is going to mark our booking as proposed, and it's going to update our transaction state to pre-authorized so that we move to this stage here in our diagram. After that, the host is then able to accept or decline the booking. So what we're going to want next is we're going to want to have an action for like accept booking and one for decline booking. So I'm going to create 2 more actions here. This one I'm going to call accept booking. And all we need to do in this accept booking one is update the record in our bookings table to accepted, and also update our transactions table to accepted, so we know the transaction's in a accepted state. So again, I'm going to run this as a action. I'm going to do the transaction ID, the transaction that we're dealing with. So then I can now add an event here. And in this event, I want to update my booking. So let's create a variable here, which is going to be my booking that I'm going to update. And that's going to be the booking that belongs to this given transaction. So I can say where transaction ID equals the transaction ID that's passed into this action. And then I can add another variable here, which is going to be my actual transaction that I want to update. So I can do transaction. And I can say where, again, the ID is equal to the transaction ID that I'm passing in. And now I can just do 2 updates. So the first update can be update the transaction. And I'm going to say, let's set we just want to update the state ID. So the transaction state ID, I want to set that equal to the accepted state. So that is this 4th one here. So as with the other examples, I could come here and do another number one and call this transaction state accepted. It'd be number 3. What was it, number 4? Let me double check. Sorry, it's number 4. Let's go back and make that number 4. And then I'm also going to create one for the booking as well while we're here. So let's look in our booking states table. Got one here called accepted, which is number 3. So I could create a new global variable here called booking state accepted. And then I can do an update, say update. I'm going to set the transaction ID equal to the accepted state. And then I'm going to do the same for the booking. So I'll just do another update underneath here. And in this one here, I can just update my booking and set the state ID equal to the booking state accepted. So now I can track moving to the accepted state on my booking and transaction. And then the other one I said is the provider could also decline the booking. So we could have one here called decline booking, which is going to be, again, a action. And in here, again, I just want to give it the transaction ID. And I'm going to, again, do the same thing as the last one. Essentially, I'm going to look up the transaction that I want to be updating. So let's say where ID equals the transaction ID that I'm passing in. And then let's do the same for the booking. So we'll look up the booking, say where the transaction ID is equal to the transaction ID that I'm passing in. And then I'm just going to do a couple of updates again. So I'll do updates, transaction, create another global variable down here, which is going to be, let's see, transaction state declined. Should be, again, number variable. I think I left this one out. Let me check. So I come back to my transaction states table. I want to have one here for decline, which will be number 7. Number 34, I guess I've added other ones in the meantime. So let me just update that. Let's add that. Oh no, I put in the same name here. Should be declined. And then we'll do booking state declined as well. So I can now update my transaction state ID to the declined one. And then I could do the same for my booking as well. So let's pick the booking that I looked up, and let's set the state ID here to declined. You can see for these, I've added this condition that the transaction should be in the state of pending or proposed. So we don't want to allow people to decline bookings that have already gone through. And there were some conditions on these last ones as well. We'll come back and talk about implementing those in a little while. First off, let's just go down. So if we have a look here now, we said the user can come and initiate their transaction, which involves creating a booking, initializing the whole transaction, creating some payment link. That payment link then goes through, which will update the transaction to this pre-authorized state here and actually make the payment. And at that point, the provider can either decline or accept, at which point we mark the booking as accepted or as declined. And we also update the transaction to accepted or declined. Once the booking has been accepted or declined, there'll be a window before it actually starts. And during that window, the person making the payment can actually cancel their booking as well. So we'll have one more action here, which can be cancel booking, which will be, again, action type. And again, we're just going to give it the transaction ID. I'm going to add 2 variables. Same as before, we'll have one called transaction, which is going to be the transaction that we're dealing with. So that's where the ID is equal to the transaction ID. And then we'll have the booking, which is the booking that's going to be getting cancelled. And that will be the one where the transaction ID is equal to the transaction ID that we're passing in again. So now we can do add events. And again, we can just do a couple of updates to mark the booking state ID equal to the cancelled state. So if we look in our bookings table, our booking states table, we should have one as cancelled. So let's create a couple more of these global variables. We have booking state cancelled. And again, I think you might need to add a transaction state for this. Let's see. Yeah, we could add a cancelled one here as well. So then let's do transaction state cancelled. And I'm just going to mark my different states here. So I'll say state ID is equal to booking state cancelled. And then after this, I'm going to say mark the transaction as cancelled as well. So we could do update transaction, say set the state ID equal to cancelled. for now, we've got ways for the host to accept the booking or decline it. And then we've also got a way for the customer to cancel their booking. In reality, these are going to get run from the front end of the app again. So we're going to have ones that are, we're going to have actions that are triggered by an endpoint to allow them to get run from the front end. So we might have one here called, let's say, accept booking. And I might actually just mark these as like EP for endpoint, just to differentiate. So we could now do this one here. We could do something like accept booking. All we need to do is pass it the transaction ID that we want to accept. And then I can just run one of these other actions. So I could do run action and then pick the accept booking action and pass in the transaction ID. And we can add a couple more in a bit for the endpoints for the decline and cancel as well. But for now then, let's say that we've got to this stage here, we've accepted it. It's going to move to the delivered stage. This will happen again based on some notification from the payment provider, where we actually make a payout to the provider of the listing. And then once it's in the delivered state, the user obviously goes and stays at listing for X amount of time. And after that, they post their reviews. So let's have a look. We're going to need to have options here to post customer and provider reviews. So let's just add those two options in here now as well. So we'll have new action here, which we can call post customer review. This is going to be again, triggered by an action. And what we want to do in this, we want to give it the rating and the content. So if we look in our reviews table, the information we want to capture is the rating and the content here. The other fields we've got are going to be things like the person who actually made the review, and then the person that the review is about. So let's add two more inputs here. So one is going to be the content, which will be a text field, and the other is going to be the rating, which will be a number field. And then I can just actually add one more, which is going to be the transaction ID. And let's also do, actually it's probably okay, yeah. So what we'll do now is we'll look up the transaction to begin with. So this will be the same as we did before. Look up the transaction where the ID is equal to the ID that we're passing in to the action. And then we're going to do a create. I want to say create review, content, creator ID. These are all the fields we want. Let's see what else we've got in here. The transaction ID we want. Ratings, let's fill these in. So the content is going to be the content that we're passing in here. So that'll be content set by the user. Transaction ID is the transaction this belongs to. The rating is the rating that the person picks, which is going to come from here. The creator will be the customer ID on the transaction. The listing ID is going to be the listing that we're reviewing. So we can now also get that from our transaction. Then the subject ID is the person that we're actually reviewing. So let's see if we have a look at our transaction here, this is going to be the provider ID. And then we also have a state ID field that we want to set. The deleted and the created out will get set automatically. But the state ID is going to be the state that the review is currently in. So let me see, we had a review states table here. There are two possible states, public or pending. If it's pending, this means that no one can kind of publicly see the review yet. So all reviews are going to start in a pending state. So again, we might want to come to this global variable section here, do a number and do review state pending. And then we can just pick our state ID here and set that equal to the pending state. And this will be the new review created. So let's say create review like so. Then let's just create one other one, which will be post provider review. It's going to be almost the same. We're going to run this from an action. We're going to give it the transaction ID. Then we're going to give it the content. And we're going to give it the rating. Then we're going to look up the transaction that we're dealing with, same as always. So we'll do transaction where the ID is equal to the transaction ID that we're passing in. And then again, we can just add an event here, which is going to be the create event. And here we're just going to create another review with the similar fields. We don't need deleted. Let's see, listing ID, rating, state ID, subject ID, transaction ID. These other ones we don't need to set. So the content is going to, again, be the content we pass into our action. The creator ID is going to be the, in this case, it's going to be the provider, because it's going to be the provider that's posting the review. And the subject ID in this case is going to be the customer. So that's the main difference, is those two are going to be flipped around. Then the listing is going to be the same. This will be the listing ID on the transaction. The rating is going to be that rating that we pass in. And the state ID is going to be the pending state again. And then the transaction ID here will be the transaction ID that we're passing in. This will be our new review. So this now allows these kind of two parts here. We get the provider can post a review and the customer can post a review. And then at some point, these two reviews need to be moved to the reviewed status. They basically need to be updated so that they're public. So the last one was going to add quickly now is this post reviews one here. And this is just going to take any reviews in the transaction and mark them as published. So we can add a final action here. Post reviews. This will be a trigger action again. The input is going to be the transaction ID that we're dealing with. And then I'm going to look up my reviews. So I'm going to this time use a collection variable reviews. And this is going to be all of the reviews that belong to this given transaction. So I'm just going to now use a loop event. So I could say I want to loop through these different reviews. So there'll be two reviews that I'm looping through. And then spelled that incorrectly. As I loop through, I'm just going to update the it's going to update the state of each one of these reviews. So I could just do an update and say set single review, state ID, and so I can create one more global variable, which is going to be the review state public, which is number 1. I'm going to say update the state of these reviews to number 1. So this can be mark reviews as public. So now we can kind of go through most of this process. These 2 people are going to post the reviews, and then at some point we're going to mark these as public. Coming towards the end, so give a preview. What I want to do in the next session is to just implement some of the conditions around when these different actions can actually be run. So for example, you shouldn't be able to, like I said, if we have a look at our cancel booking, you can only cancel bookings once they've been accepted. If we think about something like our views that we were just looking at a second ago, these can only be posted after the time that the listing is passed, that kind of thing. So I want to kind of implement those conditions. And I guess, now if there's any questions, we could address those for the last couple of minutes.
Awesome. I'm just going to go ahead and let people unmute themselves in case they have any questions. No questions for Samuel?
I'll propose a big thank you. This is a more complex project example, and I'm going to have to rewatch it probably 2 or 3 times.
Same.
So again, thank you.
Awesome.
Yes, thank you so much.
I'll make one last comment. I guess this is the first time we've used these action triggers here. And I didn't really mention, but the reason for this is we can now take these and basically use them anywhere in the app. So if you want to kind of reorchestrate your transaction flow so that maybe you don't need to go through like the accept section, rather than having to go and build like a whole new endpoint, you can just maybe skip that action or put another action in or something like that. So hopefully that makes sense. I'll just say final comment.
Very cool. Anyone else with questions for Samuel? Awesome. Thank you so much. This was great. We will see everyone next week. We'll continue with this example. And thank you so much, James and Samuel, for being here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
All right.